to the Triage Method podcast Q&A edition. This is a shorter podcast of the week in which we essentially just answer a question, give you what you need to know, no BS, 20 to 30 minutes out the gap. So Paddy, what's the question this week?
Well, that's the hope, Gary. This is supposed to be the shorter episode. That doesn't mean that it ever is. However, I do hopefully think that today's episode is going to be a little bit shorter than an hour at least. But yeah, so today's question is, should I wear a belt? So last week, the question was, should I wear wrist straps, knee sleeves, or elbow sleeves? And we went into quite a bit of depth with all of those. And we did touch on this, like, should I wear a belt? Because that was a separate question, but obviously it's part of that whole training equipment question. Like, what should you get, right? And there's pros and cons to a belt. There is people that are all for it and then people that are all against it. There are also different types of belts, so that obviously muddies the water. However, in today's episode, I just want you to be able to walk away from it and go, okay, there's some sort of checklist type thing. Be like, yeah, I fall into that category, so maybe a belt will be good for me. Or, yeah, I don't really care about that, so maybe a belt is not for me, right? So, but to do this, first of all, we need to discuss, what does a belt actually do? Because there's some misconceptions around this, right? So I'm going to pose that question to you, Gary. What does a belt actually do? Like, why is it going to help me potentially with my overall lifting? And, you know, maybe on what exercises is it more likely to help me, or why? And is it going to prevent injury? Those two questions, Gary. Why does a belt work? Well, I suppose three questions. Why does a belt work? What exercises is it going to work on? Like, is it going to help my curls or my calf raises? Because that's really all that matters. And is it going to prevent injury? Go.
Righty. So when I first got into lifting, I used to...
Wait, hold up. You lift?
Believe it or not, when I first started going to the gym, I remember the belts that were really popular at the time were like those belts that are like thin at the front and then they're thick at the back, and they've got this like supporting pad that goes into your back. And the explanation I was given was that, you know, it's to support your back. That's why it's wider at the back, and it's got, you know, this pad to support your back and keep it safe and prevent injury. And I think that's probably most people's understanding. It's like, I wear it to support my back and it's going to stop me from getting injured. However, like, the purpose of a belt is actually technically more so related to the front and the sides of your abdomen than it is really the back. Because essentially what it is serving to do is, the belt obviously wraps around that midsection. If you think of your abdomen, right, your abdominal cavity is essentially a somewhat fixed cavity in that it's got borders at each side. So at the back, you know, you've got the back of that abdominal cavity, muscles, fascia, etc. And you've got the spine then behind that. At the front, you've got your abdominal muscles. So you've got your transverse abdominis, you've got rectus abdominis, and then at the sides, you've got your oblique muscles. So you've got all these different sides to it. So we can see that, all right, we've got these restraints at the front, at the sides, at the back. There's things that are stopping movement, or can help to stop movement, but also then at the top and the bottom. At the top, we've got the diaphragm, and at the bottom, we've got the pelvic floor or the pelvic diaphragm. So at every end, we've got some sort of barrier that essentially creates this cylinder. Okay, so you've got this cylinder within your abdominal cavity. Obviously, all your organs are in there, I hope. And essentially what can happen is, if you build up pressure within your abdominal cavity, and you've got increased intra-abdominal pressure, it's referred to as, that can be translated to an extensor moment. And what I mean by an extensor moment is a force that is pushing your spine into extension, or like what people are generally concerned with, like stopping you from moving into flexion. So if you're doing some sort of deadlift exercise or squat exercise, what you don't want is for your back to be moving during the lift loads and you kind of losing force or leaning forward or whatever. You want to be able to keep things as rigid as possible, because that enables you to effectively transmit force through your body, whether it's a squat, a deadlift, or whatever it might be. So where the belt comes in then is that theoretically it can help you to increase your intra-abdominal pressure and to increase that extensor moment and help you to resist flexion in any of those sorts of exercises. So by providing that barrier around the abdominals, and around the obliques. It can help to increase intra-abdominal pressure. The measurement, like the last time I dug into this was about 2 years ago, and from what I can see, like the way that we measure intra-abdominal pressure is like might be potentially flawed. I think there was some potential flaws there. So I think the exact mechanisms and the exact like how much a belt is actually going to help you, it's difficult to quantify. But in some of the research that is there, you know, trying to get an idea of how much it helps in an outcome-based sense in terms of like how much does it actually help your lifting, it does seem like there's some sort of benefit there. Okay, so I look at a belt as being a tool that can potentially improve your performance, but I don't view it with the same perspective that some do in terms of it preventing injury. Like I'm not really sure about that. There's not really, we don't have like longitudinal studies, like prospective cohort studies that take people who lift with belts and lift without belts over years and like quantify their rates of injury. So couldn't say that with any degree of certainty. But I think the performance benefit or potential benefit is what people are probably most concerned with. So that's our starting point. We can go into more detail, but do you have anything to add or retract there?
No. So basically what you're saying is it's a proprioceptive tool to help you brace better, perhaps, or increase your ability to brace. You know, maybe you know how to brace and you're quite effective at it, but because you have this extra, we'll call it a muscle, you know, wrapping around, you're able to brace a little bit better. Like you're able to get an increased brace because you have something like a corset type thing braced around. Like you have something to push against effectively, you know, like like anything, if you have something to push against, you have something to transmit force into, you're going to be able to push yourself a little bit harder into that, you know, like it's just the way the world works. So yeah, I don't have much to add to that. But I suppose that does actually give us our first kind of checklist, checkpoint thing for people to start deciding whether a belt is for them or not. Like, do you know how to brace? Because if you don't know how to brace, then a belt isn't exactly going to help you, you know, because you're already missing out on the thing that the belt is going to increase, you know, like you're not bracing, you know. So if your abdominal wall caves in, collapses, or, you know, you're basically your abdomen is all over the place while you're squatting, bench pressing, overhead pressing, whatever, you're not bracing, then a belt isn't going to help you at all. Now, you may use a belt, some people might suggest this, to learn to brace, but in my mind, I'm like, that's kind of putting the cart before the horse, because you've never learned to brace without a belt, you know, and that kind of comes into effect on later discussions. Like, you have to be specific in what you're trying to train. And like we have talked about this before, about like sports specificity, and it's not exactly a great thing, a great ideology, but you do want to somewhat, you know, train as you compete. So that, or at least be able to transfer what you train into what you compete, you know? So if you can only brace, you've only ever learned to brace with a belt, I would see that as a bad thing if you then tried to or wanted to brace without a belt and you've never actually trained that, you don't have the ability, right? And this may also inform the discussion around later on, we're going to discuss about, like, if you notice that you lose a huge amount of strength if you take your belt off, like say you're squatting like 250 kilos with your belt on, and then you take your belt off and you can barely even get to 200, then in my mind, I would see that as a negative. Like you effectively crippled yourself. You know, you've introduced a tool and now you're reliant on that tool to actually be able to express somewhere near your strength. Now, I'm not talking about you have your belt on and you get an extra 20 kilos on your whatever, like you're able to do 230 without the belt and you're able to do 250 with the belt. I'm like, that in my mind, I'm like, that's fair enough. Like you're getting an extra 10% or so improvement. That's nothing huge. Like, yeah, obviously that is huge in terms of, you know, you have a performance increase, but there's not such a huge discrepancy that I would be overly worried about, you know? But if there is a huge discrepancy, like you're knocking off like 20-30% off your lifts as soon as you take the belt off, I would see that as a negative. But anyway, do go on, Gary.
Yeah, so that then, I guess, like, it begs the question of like, all right, so should I use one? When should I use one? What's it going to be beneficial for? And we kind of somewhat alluded to that already. So typically, you're going to be wanting to use a belt during an exercise where you have to effectively transmit force from your lower body to your upper body. That's typically kind of how it works. Or like even more so than that, you're trying to resist spinal extension and trying to maintain or spinal flexion rather. You're trying to maintain a really rigid torso. And those exercises tend to be squat variations, deadlift variations, potentially overhead press variations. And like, I don't use it for an overhead press, but I know some people do and seem to get a benefit from it. And like, some people use them for bench press, but I never have. And I can't really, like, I don't think the benefit is going to be huge, but I mean, if it reduces your perception of fatigue during the lift and allows you to do more reps and more sets, by all means try it. But I wouldn't include it.
I think people use it on the bench press because it is a really good proprioceptive tool, because what you see a lot of people do on the bench press is not maintain a brace throughout the whole lift. Like, they don't brace while doing the eccentric portion, and then while the bar is on their chest or whatever, they then try to brace or transmit force through the legs, because your legs are involved in it if you're doing like a powerlifting bench. So it effectively reminds you to keep yourself braced throughout the entire lift. So again, it is a true proprioceptive tool. It's not necessarily that it increases performance, it's that it keeps you in the right position, or at least that's what I see people using it for, or it appears. Again, you might notice that you do get some performance increase because, again, like, you are transmitting force through the legs, through the hips, through the core by, pressing your feet into the ground on your bench press. You are using some leg drive on your bench press. But again, like, the point of contact is basically the shoulders on the bench press. So, the magnitude is probably going to be reduced.
Yeah, like, I think the magnitude of effect is likely to be smaller, but again, like, as you said, if it helps you, like, if you know that it helps you to brace better, then by all means do it. Like, there's very little downside there, so by all means give it a shot. But those squat and those deadlift variations, probably the ones where they're likely to help the most. Overhead press potentially, and then bench press, like, maybe not so sure. Generally, like, for things like rowing variations and stuff like that, like, yeah, you could say there might be a benefit, but to be honest, if you're being honest with yourself, your bent over barbell row is going to be a fairly low percentage of what you normally deadlift. So maintaining that position shouldn't be that challenging, but I mean, again, it's person specific. If it helps you, I mean, I don't have anything against you doing it. What I would be somewhat against is people who wear their belts for like every single exercise. Like, I think it's the idea that it's going to keep your waist smaller. That's one of the things that people in the physique sphere will wear a belt for. And like, I wouldn't consider that a valid justification for it. I think that's unlikely to be helpful, to be honest. I think if you're worried about your waist size, primarily genetics, like, you might be able to do some things to help it. But getting leaner is almost always the best option. So I wouldn't spend too much time touching on that. The main one is the performance benefits. So I guess, like, what you said there was, you might consider something like a 10% or slightly less than 10% performance increase to be normal. But what I probably wouldn't want is someone being so dependent on their belt, like, much like our discussion last week in relation to all the other equipment, that they can't do any sets without their belt. They can't do any training without their belt. Like, if you're putting 60 kilos in the bar for your warm up and your 1 rep max on the deadlift is 180, and you're putting your belt on right away, like, I just don't think that's a good relationship to have with your lifting tools. I think they should be reserved for when you really need them, and that you should be at least be able to train without them. There's some of that is just my opinion and probably the way I look at the world, and you can disagree with that. But some of it is also because if you're not always going to have that equipment with you, then you don't want it to be the case that you can only train when you have it. If you're going on holidays and you don't want to bring your belt, like, you don't want to just be totally afraid to do any sort of squats or deadlifts because you don't have your equipment with you. I don't think that's a good way of going about things. As you said as well, it could be the case that you mightn't be prepared for other lifting tasks in everyday life. Maybe if you're only ever lifted with a belt, and obviously that's an extreme example. There's not many people that are lifting washing machines every day, but have only ever deadlifted with a belt. But it's at least worth thinking about. So if I was going to use a belt, I'd use it primarily for the squat or deadlift variations. I'd use it when I get close to the weights that I'm going to be working with. Like personally, I do, for most of my deadlift training, I actually don't really wear a belt, to be honest. It does help me a little bit, but I find it helps me more on squat variations than it does on deadlift variations. So I'm less concerned with that. And if you hear me speak like that, then you should be thinking to yourself, okay, like what does a belt help me with? What exercises might I benefit most from using a belt on? And then you start to put those decisions together to make some decisions for yourself. And also, the benefit that you get from a belt is going to depend on your ability to use it. Bracing on your own and bracing with a belt can feel somewhat different. And it's about getting used to, right, how tight do I need the belt to be? How am I going to take my breath and breathe and brace? Because personally, like at this point, I could wear a belt and like it feels subconscious. Like if I'm bracing against a belt, I don't have to think about it anymore. Whereas some people, the second they put on a belt, they feel like they're gasping for air because it's challenging their breathing, and they're like, I don't know how to brace. And I remember that when I first started using one. So you have to go through that learning process. So initially, it might be the case that you put on a belt, makes no difference. But it could be the case that 6 to 12 weeks, actually getting 10 kilos extra. And that might be worth it for you if you take your strength or your hypertrophy training really seriously. Because from a strength perspective, very clearly more weight on the bar is useful. From a hypertrophy perspective, if you get more reps of squats at a particular weight with a belt versus without it, then you're accumulating more training volume for those lower body muscles without having, like, it's not the case that it's actually making it easier on those muscles either. So yeah, that would be the justification, I guess. Do you have anything to throw in there?
Well, just on that as well, like there is a thought process, and well, we'll get onto another one in a second, but there's a thought process that, wearing a belt may reduce, like this is directly what you're saying here, may reduce your, we'll say, muscle activation in the muscles of the low back and stuff. Like you'll see there's a lot of a push in like the kind of physique, the bodybuilding world, to people be like, oh, beltless pulling, like they always do their deadlifts or whatever beltless, because they want to build up the musculature of the low back or whatever. So do you think that using a belt could potentially negatively impact those muscles because you're effectively taking them out of the equation, by using the belt? Now, obviously that's not true, but even if that were the case, do you think it's offset by the potential benefit you would see from muscle activation elsewhere that has to, you're able to increase, for example, like you're saying, you might be able to increase your squat a little bit more when you're wearing a belt, and that might result in bigger glutes, bigger hamstrings, bigger quads, whatever. And like, is it offset even if there is an effect at all?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat unlikely that you're going to notice a meaningful difference in like your back extensor development because you wore a belt. I mean, obviously this isn't perfect evidence, but like if you're thinking about that from a physique perspective, like just look at the spinal extensors of most of the best powerlifters in the world, or any strong powerlifter. They all wear belts all the time. They all got ruthless spinal extensors. So I mean, that's clearly not very scientific reasoning, but it gives you some insight into the fact that, all right, it's not like this is just switching those muscles off. Like clearly not. And obviously people know that. Like, is it going to make a massive difference if you take the belt off to like your hypertrophy outcomes in those muscles? Like, I doubt it, because essentially what you're doing is you're not necessarily, you're not inhibiting your spinal extensors. You're basically bringing your abdominal muscles in a 3D perspective up to scratch. You're helping your ability to use those muscles. So you're helping your ability to support the trunk overall. And I guess if you were using that logic that is bad for the back extensors, then you also have to consider that, okay, that might be the case, but if your performance or your total reps you were doing is actually going to be less if you're not using the belt, then there's a trade-off there between, right, the additional reps and the additional performance that you're getting versus the change in potentially muscle excitation or activation, relatively speaking, between different muscles. So I think it's like, that's an interesting question to pose and be like, oh yeah, that's a good one for researchers to try and answer, like the different muscle activation patterns, so to speak, between these different exercises. But I just don't think it matters for your actual outcomes. I mean, I recall reading a paper, I can't remember when it came out, but it was about differences in hamstring excitation with a belt versus not wearing a belt. And like I can't remember the exact context of the study, and I don't like to rely too much on EMG evidence to say, oh, do this exercise. But what that said to me was like, oh yeah, that's interesting. Could be something to that, but it's not going to change anything I do in practice, and that's the case with a lot of studies. Like, I would always like caution people not to get too excited when you see studies like being like, oh, there was an increase in muscle activation with this condition. Like, you're measuring something neurological that, the conditions aren't always perfect in a lot of sports science studies when EMG is applied. And there's also like not solid evidence to show us what that means in the long term in terms of adaptation. So if someone is thinking about that, that a belt is going to like stop them from growing their lower back muscles, like, I doubt that's relevant. I doubt it. Like, I don't know. It might be relevant to what degree, not sure, but I don't think it's something I would consider anyway. What do you think?
But then it begs the question, the next logical question would be, and it kind of goes converse to what some people think. If we are then increasing the activation of, we'll say your other abdominal muscles, your transverse abdominis, your obliques, whatever the fuck, if we're getting an increased activation by using a belt with those, is it likely to make your waist thicker?
Well, the logic that people normally have is that beltless training makes your waist thicker. That's right, isn't that's what people normally say. It's funny. I feel like we're trying to argue points that we don't even, positions that we don't even hold. But I'm not sure. To be honest. I don't know.
Because I would argue that like using a belt, like if we're going to argue that the benefit of it is that it increases the activation of the muscles that allow you to brace, then effectively those muscles are going to get more tension on them, because that's what we're doing here by using this belt. We're activating them, whatever you want to call it, and therefore there's going to be more tension on those muscles, and that's how you drive hypertrophy. So in my mind, I'm like, you could make a very logical conclusion from that and say that it's likely to increase your abdominal thickness. But like you're saying there, how much? Like, that stuff is also very largely genetic. So like, is it likely to lead to a meaningful increase? Like, are you even going to notice like a centimeter extra abdominal growth? Like, that might actually be beneficial. It might make your abs a little bit thicker and they pop more, It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, that would be an I don't know question. So like, when it comes to like the specific effects of belts on like this muscle activation versus this muscle activation and what that means for outcomes, like, I'm pretty comfortable saying don't know, not sure, but I think the consideration, like those considerations, probably not too important for most of our listenership.
I agree. I also think that ultimately it doesn't matter. Like, people that are using belts or are getting an effect from belts, like, I don't think they really care if their abs get an extra millimeter of growth from this. Like, I don't think it matters overall. So do you have anything else to add just to that?
No, I think that's solid. Like, I think people understand, like, right, there's probably something to the belt potentially helping, but now it's about, I guess, getting practical.
Yeah. So practically speaking, let's go through a few different populations, because I think that's the easiest way to cover a lot of ground, right? So we have this person that previously injured their back and they want to get back into lifting. Maybe they injured their back lifting, maybe they injured it outside. Are you going to say yay or nay to the belt, and what are the caveats? They want to get back in deadlifting, overhead pressing, squatting, whatever else, but they have that little bit of a fear for the lower back. Belt, yay or nay?
Yeah, so like I think people could probably guess my answer to this from listening to the rest of our podcast. But my big consideration here is that you want to help the person and you want to help them to train without pain, but you don't want them to get dependent on it. Okay, so there's a risk here that someone could come into the gym, you teach them how to use a belt, and suddenly they're like, "Oh my god, my back feels great! I'm actually able to do this," and they go away with the association that, right, had back pain, used the belt, fixed my back pain, feeling good, and then they're dependent on the belt over time. So if I was going to introduce a belt for someone like that, I'd be saying, look, this helps with performance. You might feel that it changes the way your back muscles work. It mightn't feel you mightn't feel them working as much. That depends. I probably wouldn't give them that premise. But I'd want them to understand that this was a kind of a performance-based thing, that I wasn't just saying like, this is here to protect your back or fix your back or whatever, because I think that can be potentially harmful. And like, that's the difficult thing with coaching in general, I think, is that you actually have to weigh up like the trade-offs, the pros and cons of the way that you communicate things, as opposed to just the intervention itself, which can be difficult. And that's something we've talked about before in terms of like your coaching footprint. Because as a coach, you could help someone by showing them how to use a belt, and it helps their performance and their lifting, and it's all great. But there's a certain coaching footprint that is left behind there by you telling the person that maybe they needed. Like, for example, one narrative you could have said to them was, you need to wear this belt because it's going to stop you from bending your back, and if you bend your back, that's going to lead to herniation of the disc and degeneration of your discs and back pain. And like the end does not justify the means in that case, like from my perspective, because while you did get to a point where the person was performing a bit better and maybe their pain had reduced, you did that via a narrative that could potentially lead to problems for them in the future. Okay, so they're the types of things I'd be thinking about there. But should that person wear a belt? It's certainly not contraindicated. I wouldn't say no, I wouldn't say yes. But again, it's probably going to come back to whether or not they're in one of the categories that we're going to talk about. Because if someone comes into me with back pain, is that enough of a reason for me to think they need to use a belt? Like, no, not at all. Like, that's not a reason that I get people to use belts. I get people to use belts because I think there might be performance benefit. So if they want to avail of a performance benefit, then yeah, absolutely, let's get after it. If they come in and say, oh, I need to start using a belt because I hurt my back and I wasn't wearing a belt, then there'd be some education involved in terms of saying that, oh, look, it probably wasn't because you weren't using a belt, and you probably don't need to be dependent on that. And then we try and get some graded exposure going by, all right, let's do a goblet squat. Let's do a front squat. Let's do some light back squats, and so on.
Cool. Right. I think that answered it. I have nothing else to add to that. Again, like, don't make someone fearful or dependent, and you're pretty good to go as a trainer. And if you are an individual training yourself, don't make yourself fearful or dependent, and you're pretty good to go. So next one, a powerlifter, a strength athlete, even a strongman, whatever the fuck, right? Their lifting is based on the premise that they need to lift the maximal amount of weight. Now, obviously, that's not the premise of strongman, but obviously it applies to a large degree. Belt, yay or nay?
Yeah, I see entirely no reason not to use a belt if you're one of those athletes, if it helps you. As we kind of alluded to earlier, there might be, rationale for doing beltless training every now and then. Like if it does challenge the muscles differently, and it maybe puts more of a challenge in your ability to brace because you don't have that additional help, maybe that might be helpful at times. But for the most part, if you have good reason to believe that something's going to improve your performance and it is legal within your sport, there is no reason not to use it. I think it's pretty simple.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I do think on top of that, you probably should do some time not training with the belt, like we alluded to earlier on. Like, again, I don't think you should be dependent on the belt. Like, you still should be able to train without it, if for nothing else except for the ability to train in other places, other environments where you may not have access to your favorite INSER or SBD or whatever belt, like you're on holidays in fucking Thailand in the back arse of fucking nowhere. You stumble across the gym and you're like, yeah, I actually wouldn't mind getting a cheeky workout in. Like if that means that you now are only able to use like 50% of what you know you're able to do. Like that's not a great way to be able to train. Whereas if you're like, oh, I can actually train effectively without my belt, that's probably a good thing. You're able to travel, you're able to go to different gyms, you're able to still train effectively in different environments. Yeah, okay, cool. You've knocked off 10% off your top end. Not a big deal in my mind. But if you are knocking off like 20, 30, 50%, that's probably a big deal in my mind, at least. Anything to add to that?
Nope, I think that's fair.
Fantastic. So next one then is your gen pop. Someone, fucking Mary down the street, John up the road. They just want to look, feel, perform better, enjoy better health, lose a bit of body fat, get generally stronger for everyday life. Belt, yay or nay?
Maybe. So when I see most kind of gen pop people in the gym using a belt, the vast majority of people use it wrong. As in, like, most people will kind of just pick up one of the crappy little belts from the side of the gym and they just put it on and they squat as they normally would. Like, they don't really brace. They just kind of put it on. It's not even tight. They don't really get the benefit from it. So I'm not sure how much traction the idea of using a belt has in kind of the general population. Because like most people don't seem to use it properly, so maybe they don't notice the benefit. But I'm not sure. So just trying to gauge like whether or not people use them, whether they should use them. Like, ultimately, it does come down to how serious you take your training. As in, if your 1 rep max or 3 rep max or 5 rep max matters to you, and maybe if every last 0.1% of muscle gain matters to you, the former is much clearer than the latter. Like, how much of a difference it's going to make to your hypertrophy outcomes, I'm like, I'm not sure. To your strength outcomes, it probably matters. So depending on how much you care about those, and depending on how much money you're willing to spend on something that isn't necessary for your training, that is how I would weigh up that decision. Because the thing is, a good belt they're quite expensive. As in, if this is something you do and don't really take seriously, if you're just casually going to the gym, I don't think you need to spend 60, 80, 100 euros on an expensive belt. But if you are in the game for a while, you love lifting, you'd love to get your deadlift up as heavy as it could possibly be, and that you're like, that is my goal, then a belt is going to help you to reach that maximum potential. But for most people that are just going to the gym, I just want to be healthy, want to be in kind of good shape, I go with the lads. I'm like, yeah, I kind of stick to a program, but at the same time, like, I'm not too worried. I'm happy to change my exercises. I'm not emotionally attached to any numbers. Like, it's definitely not necessary. So it's a choice more so than anything, I think.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Like training the gen pop. If someone was like, yeah, I actually want to wear a belt, I like it, I feel whatever, I feel it improves my performance. Yeah, maybe even if there is a placebo effect, they're like, I feel a little bit safer doing these things or whatever. I'm like, cool. In my mind, I don't see a huge issue. You're like, yeah, you maybe want to educate them and say like this isn't probably going to decrease your injury risk or anything, but if they feel safer and they're like, yeah, it's cool, I don't mind too much with someone using the belt then, again, like you said, like I wouldn't make someone go out and buy a belt, but if they were like, oh, I got a belt for free as a present from my fucking granny who knows I like lifting or whatever, like, cool, use it if you want, don't use it if you don't want. This kind of goes as well, like the overall design of your program. Like if your program is basically like machine based, it's probably going to do fuck all for you. Whereas if you are more so in the realm of like, oh yeah, I like these big quote unquote compound exercises, I really like pushing my strength development and whatever, maybe it's going to help you. Maybe it's going to help you achieve both your muscle building goals and your strength goals. Cool. Like you might have to have a bit of a learning curve, like we were saying earlier on, and it's going to take a few weeks for you to really get used to using it and to actually be able to use it. But yeah, I'm in the camp of use it if you want, don't use it if you don't want. It's, in my mind, it's not going to be the make or break of the program.
Yep, all about that life.
Now, we actually have two more examples, but the first one, well, we have to discuss something in between one of the examples. But the next one then is you are an athlete. And what I mean by this is you engage in sports outside of the gym. Big shock horror, I know.
Right.
you're using the gym as a supplementary activity to either increase your performance, increase your physique as a whole, or just as an adjacent health builder. Maybe even injury prevention we'll put under that as well. So you're going to the gym as a supplement to your sporting activity. And I'm not even going to classify it as sporting activity because I don't think it matters hugely, because you could be a field sport athlete, you could be a fight sport athlete, I mean, like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, MMA, boxing, whatever the fuck, and you could be a fucking chess athlete, whatever the fuck, there, whatever sport you engage in, it doesn't really matter. You're an athlete, right? So very few sports demand that you wear a belt while competing, right?
Not many.
Maybe like some of the like car sports, like I think you have to wear a belt then. Maybe you don't. But yeah, most sports, strongman being a bit of a difference. Some other sports we'll get into some in a second. But what are your thoughts on that? Because there is obviously a thought process where you should train as you compete. Like what's his name? Fucking Musashi said, like, let your everyday stance be your fighting stance, and that stuck with people, So like if we do BJJ, so we don't use belts in BJJ. Like we don't use a big fucking lever belt. I'm not clicking that on into place while I'm about to go fucking roll. Like, so should I train the same as I compete? What are your thoughts, Gary?
So you mean you don't tie your like BJJ belts so tight that like you brace against it every time you move? No, you don't.
No, that would actually be stupid, Gary.
I
take that off mid-match and.
Mrs. Trunchbull, actually, do you know Mrs. Trunchbull?
I do, of course, yes.
Matilda, she used to wear a belt all the time, even when she was beating up kids and throwing them by the hair. So I mean, like, if that's what you're about, you're a school principal, you like to grab kids by their pigtails and throw them over the fence, I mean, that might be a useful application. Other than that, there are very few sports, as you said, where there's this where you just wear a belt and it's there to help you legally. But like the typical argument that people have is that if you train with a belt, then you're not going to be able to effectively translate that strength over into sport. And like I think that makes sense, like when you're just like, oh yeah, cool, good idea, but at the same time it doesn't really make sense, as in like the purpose of strength and conditioning training for sport is not necessarily to replicate the sport. It is to build, I feel like we had this exact conversation last week, didn't we? Yeah, we did.
We basically did, yeah.
It's to build the fitness characteristics that could potentially help you in your sport. So for example, if you are squatting, your goal is probably primarily to build lower body strength. So you're saying to yourself, I want to build quads and glutes and adductors and hamstrings, not so much hamstrings, that can produce high amounts of force. A belt could be a valid part of that training process. It's not going to take away from your ability to develop that lower body strength. So I don't think it's a problem to do that. And then to try and translate that over into your sport, because you're building the basic fitness characteristics and you're saying, okay, that's tucked away, my strength is taken care of, boom, done. Similarly, like if someone was doing endurance training, but like if they normally play in studs, like they wear football boots, but they do all their endurance training in like Asics, is that going to stop them from using their new increased VO2 max when they're on the pitch? Like, no, of course it's not. Like, it mightn't be perfectly specific, but it doesn't necessarily need to be in order to translate over to sport. So, if you're playing rugby and you're in a scrum, I would find it hard to argue that because you've only trained in a belt before, that your lower body strength is now not going to carry over to your ability to push and produce force in a scrum. So, I think a belt can still be used as part of the training process, even if you are doing a sport that doesn't allow it. I'm not sure, like if there's any sport you can think of where you're actually doing a deadlift task or squat task that it's very similar and you're not wearing a belt, then fair enough. That might be a case for saying, all right, beltless training might be more of a priority, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Well, I actually have two, but anyway, that's the next question. But I'm 100% behind you. on this, because I think the issue comes back to something that we've already discussed. People have a huge discrepancy between their belted and their non-belted, and that, in my mind, would be a potential issue. Like if you are noticing that you built up your strength, your lower body strength in your squat, or fucking even built up your deadlift or whatever with a belt, and you take off the belt and all of a sudden you notice there's this huge decrease in performance, I'm like, that, in my mind, I'm like, that's not training specifically for how you're going to compete. Like, we want general adaptations, yes, but if you're effectively using something to give you extra adaptations, but then those adaptations don't translate into increases in the environment we want to see, then it's useless in my eyes, and that goes for everything you do in the gym outside of even this belted discussion. Like if you're spending whatever 2-3 training sessions per week strengthening your lower body and you see no increase from it in your sport, then like what's the point of doing that? Like if your goal is to increase your sport from your resistance training and you're not seeing any decreased injury risk, you're not seeing any performance increase, I'm like, well, your training program needs to reflect your actual goals. So just because some guy in fucking on the internet was like, oh, you should do strong lifts 5x5 3 times per week, squat every single training session, and it's not increasing your performance, then something needs to change, So if you are resistance training, you wear a belt and you're not actually translating that into a non-belted environment, then potentially there's an issue there, So you still have to discuss the transferability of your belted training, So I can definitely get behind the argument of training beltless to increase your sport performance because it's more specific to the task, or likely more specific to the task, So that 100% I can get behind, but I'm also not so dogmatic in that if someone was coming to me and they were like, I wear a belt, I noticed that there's, again, like we'll say 10%, this is an arbitrary number out of my fucking ass, but I see a 10% decrease in performance when I don't have a belt on, and I'm able to slowly but surely continue to get stronger over time with the belt and still only see that 10% decrease, then I see no issue, because the transferability of belted training to non-belted training, and hopefully then your sports performance, is still there. It's still relevant. In my mind, it only becomes an issue if you don't see that transferability. Like you're able to squat 100 kilos without a belt, and you're able to get your then belted max up to 150 kilos, and then you take off the belt and you're still only able to squat 100 kilos, then in my mind, I'm like, that's not transferable to your sport, or likely not transferable to your sport, because you're not seeing an increase in the general physical preparedness of those bracing muscles, those trunk muscles that you want to see from doing that activity, So I'm not against using a belt if you want to increase your sports specific performance, even if your sport doesn't allow you have a belt. However, it does have to be transferable. So if you are increasing your strength while wearing a belt, ensure that it is also increasing your strength while not wearing a belt. I think that's kind of common sense.
I think that's fair.
Right. Now, the next one goes on to these sports that do allow you to wear a belt. Well, outside of powerlifting, and also get into these movements. So there are obviously different types of belts. There's thicker belts, there's fucking 13 millimeter, 10 millimeter, there's lever belts, there's fucking whatever those things are called, prong belts. There's all different kinds of belts. There's like Velcro belts, etc. Right? Now, there are 2 sports that involve Olympic weightlifting, right? And Olympic weightlifters, I do believe, are allowed wear belts in competition. However, they don't wear like a 13 millimeter or even a 10 millimeter belt in most cases, because they're too thick and they potentially get in the way of that deep squatting, deep squat position, which we've talked about before. With regard to Olympic lifting, like you want to catch that barbell as low as possible, So if you are wearing a belt that then stops that even by a couple of millimeters, that's potentially a negative impact on your training performance. If you're not able to get into that deep position, you effectively have to relearn or learn a new technique to catch the bar a little bit higher, and so there's always the potential for that, right? And that is why you see Olympic lifters generally wear kind of thinner belts, sometimes the Velcro type belts. I do believe it's legal. I'm not an Olympic lifting expert, but I do believe it's legal to wear belts in competition. And the same with CrossFit. You're allowed to wear belts, and again, they might wear a thinner one, more of those kind of Velcro-y type belts, because they're going to get into these deep, challenging type positions. You sometimes also see it in like strongman. They use different types of belts because they're going to be in a position that requires a little bit, we'll call better flexibility, better mobility. They want to be able to actually get into deeper positions than, say, powerlifting, which is basically a half squat. That's the deepest position you're likely to get into. So those two sports, in my mind, I'm like, if you're allowed, use the belt and it's specific to your competition, then by all means use it, and even if it's not relevant to that position, this is more kind of relevant towards the CrossFit. I shouldn't say not relevant to that position, not allowed in that competition. Like you might be doing, I don't know, fucking burpees, I don't know, fucking wall balls, you're squatting down and throwing the ball up onto the fucking wall, whatever CrossFit do, they do everything. You may not be able to use a belt in that position, but that doesn't mean, or you might not be allowed, but that doesn't mean that building up your strength with the belt for the events that you're allowed to use it in, and then also transferring that strength to the events that you're not allowed to use it in, or that doesn't make sense to use it in. You're traveling from different things. I don't know, you're fucking swimming then onto a salt bike. I don't know, CrossFit do fucking whatever weird stuff, so maybe you're not allowed to use it for a certain thing, or it doesn't make sense to use it for that. As long as, like we were saying with the other sports, as long as the transferability is there, like there's not this huge discrepancy, then I see no issue. And again, with the Olympic lifting example, if you're allowed to use your belt in competition, then fucking use every single last adaptation that you can get, every single last tool that you can use to increase your performance. Fucking go for it. What are your thoughts on that, Gary?
Yep, I'm about that life. I mean, if you're, as I said, if there's something that is legal in your sport and you have the option to use it and it improves your performance, then you should use it. As you said, there might be some differences between the types of belts that might be appropriate for different individuals. I think that might even change depending on, some people, for example, might have loads of ribs. You could have a couple of extra ribs and they're like quite close to your pelvis. And when you put on a belt, you find it really uncomfortable. Or maybe you store more or less body fat in a particular area that makes a particular belt more or less comfortable. So maybe you want to play around with the type of belt that you use. A clear example of that is, as you said, in Olympic weightlifting, they use a thinner belt for a very specific reason, whereas in powerlifting, you're generally using a much thicker belt. So you can play around with the different types of belts. It's ultimately up to you to really give a shot. But yeah, if you're training for strongman, you're training for weightlifting, you're training for powerlifting, these different strengths, you can legally use a belt, then I would use the one that is going to enhance my performance the most. Yeah, that's pretty much as simple as it gets, really.
Fantastic. Anyway, do you have anything else to add to this discussion then, Gary?
I don't think so. I suppose it is, while you can give a lot of talk to all this stuff, a lot of it does come back to make your own decisions. You're an adult, use a belt if you want. That's kind of where we end up, because the adaptations we're talking about, we're generally talking about relatively minute differences. In strength, yeah, it can make a difference, but none of these things are going to drastically increase or decrease injury risk, nor are they going to drastically increase or decrease the adaptations you get from a given training session. So if you take your training seriously, you want to use everything you can, then these can be good tools to have on board. But as we said, you don't want to get necessarily dependent on them, and you also don't want it to be the case that your performance difference between using a particular type of equipment and not using it is a very large discrepancy. You want to close those gaps where possible, but recognize that a gap being there is still normal, especially if it's a useful tool. So yeah, they'd be my summary points.
Yeah, my key takeaway from this would be that you shouldn't be dependent on it, and it definitely, well, I say definitely, it's probably not going to be helpful in the case of injury prevention. You know, like that's not necessarily what it's doing. So if you think you're wearing a belt for that reason, and you think you're decreasing your likelihood of injury, you're probably not. I would also take away from this that, you know, a belt is effectively helping you brace. So if you don't know how to brace already without a belt, I would probably learn that first before even considering a belt. Or if you've been using a belt, I would go back and just make sure that you know how to brace effectively. But yeah, main takeaway is those 2 points, really. Like, just learn how to brace, know how to brace. Maybe a belt will help you brace. And then don't become dependent on the belt. Don't be fearful as a result. And that's it.
Yep. I think
So,
that's it.
Gary, where can people find us, and where can they engage with our services, or what services do we offer?
Number one, subscribe to the newsletter. Goes out every Sunday, gives you insight into all the things we've shared on social media and other resources that we've come across on the internet that we think might be helpful for you. Not just on the internet, also books, physical books. Believe it or not, people still read real books. So that's an option too. Additionally, if you're already on the newsletter, you're like, I want more. I want to talk to you people. You can join the Triage Method community. It's our Facebook group. That's where you can actually converse with myself, Patrick, and all the other members of the group about anything you want to talk about. You know, you got a question, you got an article maybe that you liked. You're like, hey guys, look, this is good. Think you might like it. What do you think? We might say, oh, that's really interesting. Or we might say, that's utter bollocks. You know, why did you share that?
Get out.
No. Get out of the group. But yeah, so yeah, that's definitely worth engaging with. Alternatively, just follow our social media. You know, you can follow the Facebook page, you can follow the Instagram page, you can follow our Twitter. You're going to find very similar stuff there. So I would just say join the newsletter, join the Triage Method community, and you're going to have everything you need. Of course, subscribe to the podcast as well if you haven't, because I know some people do listen, but they're not necessarily subscribers. So if you subscribe, it helps us. Additionally, leave a review only if you like the podcast. If you don't like it, don't want to hear about it. No, I'm only kidding. Any constructive feedback is also welcome. And other than that, of course, we do have different services you can engage with. The one-to-one online coaching, where you work with either myself or Paddy one-on-one to basically build a program and a nutrition approach and a lifestyle approach that's going to help you reach your goals and stay with those goals for the long term. We do have spaces available so you can get engaged with that. If you'd rather a more hands-off approach, you're like, I don't know, the price tag's a bit heavy, don't need that much support. The group coaching is a good option. Program changes every month. You can modify the program further with our guidance. If you need to change around a couple of things, you'll also get guidance on nutrition, and you can engage with us and have us review your training clips and give you different tips on how to keep on progressing, etc. That's the group coaching, male and female options available. And then, of course, you can check out the store where we have 3, 4, 5, and 6 day training templates, and also a more comprehensive ebook, which is the Beginner's Guidebook. Don't be fooled by the title Beginners. It's useful for a lot of people. To be honest, anyone who is not a coach themselves or a coach in their early career, I think you could benefit from reading that ebook because it covers all the basic principles that you should be aware of when it comes to training and nutrition. Gives you enough of the sciencey stuff to know where you're going, but is also very practical in terms of like, why does this matter for programming? What does this tell you for nutrition? What foods does, like when you say protein, what do you mean? Like, what are protein-based foods? You know, those types of things. So that is everything, I believe.
You are correct, Gary.
And follow The Real Paddy Farrell on Instagram, because he's back on Instagram, but I'm still not, just for the moment.
That's very true. I'm trying to put out like a tip or trick every single day. Just gonna help people, like just whatever I'm thinking, be discussing stuff with clients, individuals, whatever, or in the gym or whatever. So basically just trying to put out a single tip every single day on fucking whatever. Probably should up my actual photo game in terms of the pictures that I take, but I don't really care that much. It takes me like 5-10 minutes to write something out and provide value, and people seem to enjoy it. You know, I get like 100 likes on my photos pretty much every time. So I'm happy with that. If that helps 100 people every single day, fucking that's cool, you know. Yeah, I have nothing else to add. Yeah, it's too easy.
It's too easy.